Hello there, and welcome to Edge of Mind. They hadn't seen the sun in 46 days. The fire was getting low, the meat was almost gone, and the worst of winter hadn't even begun. Tonight, we are going somewhere cold, somewhere dim and close, and full of the smell of wood smoke, and animals and damp wool, a place where winter was not a season you watched through a window, but something you endured from the inside, pressed shoulder to shoulder with everyone you knew, waiting for a light that was taking a very long time to return. We are going to a Viking Longhouse, sometime in the deep of a Scandinavian winter, roughly 1,000 years ago. Not the version with the helmets and the ships and the wide grey sea. The other version, the quiet one. The one where most of the living actually happened in the dim, in the cold, in the slow and difficult middle of a winter that seemed to have no end. And before we go any further, I'd love to know where you are right now. What part of the world are you watching from tonight? Whether it's late where you are, or just getting quiet, drop it in the comments. It's always so lovely to see where these evenings find people. The longhouse was long and low, built close to the earth, the way a living thing might crouch against the wind. Its walls were made of timber and turf, layers of soil and grass packed against the wood to hold the warmth in and the cold out. From a distance, in the snow, it would have been easy to miss. It looked almost like a hill, something that had simply grown there, slowly, over many seasons. Inside, it was a single room, one long open space running the full length of the building, perhaps 20 or 30 meters from one end to the other, though the walls felt much nearer than that. Along each side ran low platforms of raised earth and wood, covered in animal skins and woven cloth. These were where people slept and sat and ate and mended things, and kept their most valued belongings tucked beneath them in the dim. Down the center of the floor ran the hearth, not a fireplace set into a wall, but an open fire burning directly on the ground, a long, shallow channel of stone and ash that stretched nearly the full length of the room. The smoke rose and drifted and found its way out through a narrow gap in the roof, slowly and not always willingly. Much of it lingered first, gathering in the upper half of the room in a soft, shifting haze that smelled of pine and peat, and something older than either. The fire was the center of everything, not just warmth but light and cooking and the rhythm of the day. Someone was always tending it, feeding it small pieces of wood, watching its color, reading it the way you might read a face, for signs of what it needed, for signs of what it was about to do. A fire like that, in a winter like that, was not something you left alone. It was something you cared for, the way you cared for the animals at the far end of the room, or the children sleeping nearest the warmth, because the animals were there too. In the coldest months, the cattle and the goats were brought inside. They occupied the far end of the longhouse, separated from the sleeping area by not much more than a low partition and the habits of daily life. Their warmth was useful, a living presence that breathed and radiated heat and added to the dense, layered smell of the place. Hay and the particular heavy scent of cattle, breath in cold air. Wool drying near the fire, salted fish hanging from the rafters, tallow candles, when there were any, burning with a faint animal smell of their own. It was not a clean smell, but it was a warm one, and warmth, in those months, was the thing that mattered most. 30 people, more or less, might share a space like this through the winter, a family and its extended household, older relatives, younger children, a few farmhands who had nowhere else to go. They had been together since the autumn. They would remain together until the snow softened and the days began to lengthen again. There was no stepping outside for air, not really, not for long. The cold outside was not the kind you walked through for pleasure. It was the kind that reminded you very clearly that you were small and warm and temporary, and that the world around you was none of those things. So they stayed inside. They moved around each other in the dim, smoky light with the practiced ease of people who had learned every inch of a shared space by feel. They knew which floorboard murmured underfoot. They knew who snored and who woke early, and who needed to be left alone in the mornings. They knew the fire's moods, and the animals' moods, and the particular stillness that settled over the room in the deepest part of the night when even the youngest children had finally gone still. Outside, the wind moved across the snow in long, slow waves. The trees at the edge of the forest stood without moving. The sky held no color at all, just a dim pewter gray that faded, sometime in the early afternoon, into something softer and dimmer still. And inside the longhouse, Someone added another piece of wood to the fire and watched it slowly find its way into flame and stayed close to the warmth a little longer before moving on. That is where we are beginning tonight. In the glow, in the smoke, in the slow, patient middle of a winter that had only just begun to show what it was made of. The fire did not simply burn. It was managed, the way you might manage something alive and particular in its needs, something that could not be left alone for long without consequence. Someone was always aware of it, not watching it directly necessarily, but aware of it the way you are aware of a sound that has been present for so long it becomes part of the silence and only registers when it stops. Wood was not unlimited. Every piece that went into the fire was a piece that had been gathered, split, stacked, and carried. Work done in the warmer months against exactly this kind of need. The woodpile was a form of planning, made physical, a record of decisions made in summer about how long the winter would be, and how cold, and how many mouths would need to be kept warm through it. Running low on wood was not an inconvenience. It was a slow, quiet emergency that announced itself gradually, the way most serious things do. So the fire was fed carefully, not lavishly. The people who tended it had learned to read it the way a sailor reads water, not with instruments, but with long familiarity. They knew how much warmth a certain size of flame would give, and how long a particular kind of log would hold. They knew when the fire was beginning to pull away from itself and needed attention, and when it was settled and could be left a little longer. This knowledge was not written down anywhere. It lived in the hands and the eyes of the people who kept it, passed from one generation to the next without ceremony. The smoke was always present. The longhouse had a hole in the roof, a simple opening above the central hearth, and on still nights the smoke rose through it in a slow, steady column and disappeared into the cold above. But the wind did not always cooperate. When it shifted, or when a storm moved in from the north, the smoke had nowhere to go. It settled low in the room, gathering in the space where people breathed and slept and ate. Eyes watered. Throats grew sore over the long months. The smell of it worked its way into everything, into the wool, into the hair, into the timber of the walls themselves, so that the building carried the scent of every fire that had ever burned inside it. There was a particular quality to the light inside a longhouse in winter. It was not the kind of light that illuminated things clearly. It was the kind that suggested them shapes moving at the edges of it, faces half visible, familiar in the way that something known for a long time becomes familiar, not because you can see it precisely, but because you already know it well enough that seeing it precisely no longer matters. The tallow candles added something, when there were enough of them, a warmer note, a slightly wider reach of visibility, but they were used carefully too, because the fat that made them had other uses, and nothing was wasted. People worked in this light. The women spun and wove, their hands moving through motions so deeply learned that they required almost no attention. Wool that had been sheared and cleaned and carded through the autumn now became thread, and thread became cloth, and the work moved forward through the winter hours with a steadiness that was its own kind of warmth. The men repaired tools, carved, worked leather. Children were given small tasks, winding thread, fetching wood from the inner stack, keeping the younger ones occupied and away from the fire's edge. The work was not meant to be lively. It was the thing that kept the hours from becoming shapeless, because the hours could become shapeless. That was one of the quieter dangers of a Viking winter, not the cold itself, not the hunger that came later in the season, but the slow erosion of time's ordinary structure. When the sun was absent for weeks, when every day arrived in a dim grey half-light and faded before the afternoon had properly settled in, the rhythm that daylight normally imposed began to loosen. Morning and evening blurred into each other. Sleep came at strange times. Waking felt less like returning to the day and more like surfacing into a version of the same long, dim continuity that had been going on since autumn. The Norse had words for this, not measured, categorizing words. They had words that described the feeling of it, the heaviness that gathered in a person through the long, dim months, the sense of time moving differently, of the world outside the walls becoming something almost abstract. The darkness had a weight to it that was different from ordinary weariness. It settled into the body slowly, the way cold settles into stone, not all at once, but gradually, until you realize it has been there for some time. And so they told stories, not as entertainment exactly, though there was pleasure in it. The stories were something more structural than that, a way of filling the dim hours with something that had shape and direction, a beginning that moved toward a middle and eventually arrived somewhere. The voice of a storyteller in a longhouse on a winter night was a kind of anchor. It gave the darkness a form. It reminded the people gathered around the fire that time was still moving, that things still happened, that the world beyond the snow and the wind was still full of motion and meaning. Someone would begin, and the others would grow quiet, and the fire would go on burning, slowly and carefully, the way it always did. Outside, the snow had been falling for 3 days without stopping. The stories they told were not gentle ones. This is worth sitting with for a moment, the particular kind of story a Norse storyteller would reach for on a long winter night, with the fire low and the wind pressing against the walls, and 30 people wrapped in wool and shadow, waiting to be carried somewhere. They did not reach for comfort stories. They did not soften the edges of the world to make the darkness feel smaller. The tales that filled a longhouse in the deep of winter were full of enormous things. Gods who struggled and sometimes failed. Worlds that had been made from violence and would one day return to it. Heroes who faced what was coming without any promise that they would survive it. There was something deliberate in that. Something the Norse seemed to understand about what darkness actually needed. Not to be argued against, but to be matched. The stories named what the winter was. They gave it scale. A single longhouse full of cold and hunger and uncertain hours was inside those stories, part of something much older and wider, a world that had always moved between destruction and renewal, between the long cold and the returning light. The people listening were not simply enduring a difficult season. They were, in the language of the stories, holding on through a version of something that had always been held through. That framing was not small. It was the difference between feeling lost in the dim and feeling located within it. The Eddic poems, which carried many of these stories in their oldest form, described Fimbul winter, the great winter that would come before the end of all things. 3 winters in a row, with no summer between them. The sun grew dim, snow came from every direction, and the world went quiet in a way that was different from ordinary quiet, a stillness that had no softness in it. It is worth noticing that this was the Norse image of catastrophe, not fire, not flood, but winter without end. The thing they feared most was the thing they already knew, only stretched beyond any possible endurance. And so the winter they were living through, however difficult, was still not that. The fire was still burning, the walls were still holding. The stories about Fimbul winter were a kind of measure, a way of knowing that what they were in was survivable, because it had an end, because the sun would eventually return, because this was not the worst winter, only a hard one. The children listened to those stories with their whole bodies. You could see it in the way they went still. The restless shifting that was ordinary for small people in confined spaces would simply stop, and they would sit with their chins near their knees, watching the storyteller the way they watched the fire. Something about the voice, the rhythm of it, the way a good story moved through the air of a longhouse. It reached something in them that the cold and the dim and the weeks of sameness had been slowly wearing away. A kind of attention that had been going loose would come back together again. The adults felt it too, though they might not have named it the same way. There was a particular quality to the silence inside a story, different from the silence of exhaustion, different from the silence of people who had simply run out of things to say to each other. It was a gathered silence, a silence that was full rather than empty, and in a space where silence had sometimes felt like something pressing in from outside. That distinction mattered more than it might seem, between stories, or when the storytelling had settled into a natural pause. There was music, not music in the way we might think of it now. No instruments that needed to be carried far or kept carefully from the damp. There were simple things, a bone flute, narrow and worn smooth from handling, a small frame drum that someone's grandmother had made and someone's mother had kept. And voices, most of all. The Norse had a tradition of sung poetry, verses that moved in a particular rhythm with a particular weight on certain sounds, so that the words themselves had a kind of music woven into their shape. The sound of a voice singing in a longhouse on a winter night was not a bright sound. It did not lift or soar the way music sometimes does in open spaces. It moved along the ground, almost filling the low space between the sleeping platforms and the rafters and the fire, settling there rather than rising. The cattle shifted in their section of the building. The goats, who were generally indifferent to most things, sometimes went still. The smoke moved in its slow way toward the roof hole, and the singing went on beneath it, warm and low and older than anyone present could have said. Some of the songs were for specific things: a safe voyage, a good harvest, the memory of someone who had died. Others were simply for the night itself, for the fact of still being here, still gathered, still warm enough, still fed enough, the fire still holding its small and necessary ground against everything outside. The Norse word for fate was weird, a word that also carried the sense of something turning, something in motion, something that moved through all things, whether or not any particular person could see where it was going. The winter was part of that turning. The stories were part of it. The singing was part of it. And the people in the longhouse, shoulder to shoulder in the dim light, were part of it too. Outside, the snow had stopped falling sometime in the night, and the cold had deepened in the way it does when clouds clear, sharper and more complete, pressing against the walls with a new kind of stillness. The stars, if anyone had opened the door and looked up, would have been very bright. No one opened the door. The cold that had settled in after the snowfall was a different kind of cold than what had come before it. The wet cold of a storm has a certain quality, something almost alive in the way it moves and presses against everything it finds. But the cold that follows a cleared sky is still and complete. The way a held breath is still. It did not push against the longhouse walls, so much as surround them, evenly and without any particular urgency, as if it had all the time it needed. Inside, the fire had been fed again sometime before the deepest part of the night. Someone always woke for it. This was not arranged by any formal agreement. It simply happened, the way certain necessary things in small communities find their way to the people who will do them without being asked. A hand reached out in the dim light, found the wood stacked nearby, and placed a piece carefully so as not to disturb the coals. The flame received it slowly, the light shifting, and then settling again, and whoever had done it lay back down and was still. The smell of the longhouse in deep winter was something that no one inside it would have noticed anymore. It had been weeks since any of them had been truly outside long enough to return and smell it fresh. But it was there, layered and particular, the way all enclosed spaces that hold many living things eventually become. Smoke was the top note of it, always. Beneath that, the warm animal smell of the cattle, which was not unpleasant in the way one might expect, but rather dense and close, like something fermented and alive. The goats contributed their own sharper thread to it, and underneath all of that, the smell of people, of wool that had not been washed, of bodies that had been warm for a long time in the same clothes, of breath and sleep, and the faint sourness of the fermented whey that had been part of the evening meal. There was also something else, harder to name. The smell of the walls themselves, perhaps of the turf or timber that had been absorbing all of this for months, holding it the way old wood holds everything it has ever been near. A longhouse in February smelled like a living thing, like something that breathed. The children slept more heavily than the adults, the way children do. They had a particular ease for finding comfort in whatever was available, tucked against a parent, or against the warm flank of a dog, if one was permitted near the sleeping area, or simply curled into themselves with the softness of small bodies that have not yet learned to hold tension in their sleep. The adults did not always sleep so well. There were nights when someone lay awake for a long time, listening to the fire and the breathing of everyone around them, and the faint sounds of the animals shifting in their section of the building. What a person thinks about during those hours is their own, but the dim light and the cold and the long sameness of winter days had a way of loosening certain thoughts from where they were usually held. The Norse had a word sorg that carried the weight of grief and sorrow. They had another hugra that referred to something like the mind or the soul, the inner life of a person that continued its own movement, regardless of what the body was doing. In the long nights, the hugra moved where it would, through the faces of people who were not in the room, through summers that felt very far away, through the particular texture of worry that comes not from any single thing, but from the accumulated weight of many small uncertainties held for too long. This was understood. It was not spoken of directly, but it was understood, the way things are understood in communities where people have lived closely together through many winters and know what the season does to a person from the inside. One of the ways they moved through it was work, not the large outdoor work of the warmer months, but the quiet indoor work that winter made possible precisely because there was nowhere else to be. Women worked wool, carding it, spinning it, weaving it on upright looms that stood against the walls. The sound of a loom in a longhouse is a rhythmic, wooden sound, not loud but constant, a kind of pulse beneath the other sounds of the space. Men repaired things, harnesses, tools, the leather of boots that had been worn through. Children were given small tasks, the kind that kept hands busy without requiring much supervision. The work was practical, and everything made or mended would be needed. But it was also something else, a way of keeping the hours moving, of giving the day a shape when the light outside offered none, the hands knowing what to do next, even when nothing else was certain. There was a particular satisfaction in making something in the dim that would be used in the light. A pair of boots resoled in February would carry someone through the mud of spring. Wool carded now would be cloth by summer. The winter work was quiet and slow, and pointed forward, toward a season that was still distant, but was nonetheless coming. The fire burned through the night, and the breathing of the longhouse rose and fell around it. Outside, the cold pressed its patient weight against everything, and inside, in the dim and layered warmth, the small sounds of work and sleep, and the occasional murmur of a dream continued on, steady and unhurried, the way a river continues beneath ice, still moving in its own direction, still finding its way through. The boots would be finished by morning. Someone had been working on them for 3 evenings now, drawing the awl slowly through the leather in the low light, pulling the thread with the particular patience that comes from having nowhere else to be. The fire gave just enough to see by. The cattle shifted in their stalls at the far end of the longhouse, and somewhere near the wall, a child had fallen asleep, still holding a length of unspun wool. This was the texture of a Viking winter from the inside, not dramatic, not desperate in any visible way, but full of a dense and layered endurance that settled into the body the way cold settles into stone. Gradual, something you stopped noticing only because it had become the whole of everything. And then, somewhere in the middle of it all, the stories would begin. Not every night, not on any particular schedule, but there were evenings when someone, an older man, a woman who had seen many winters, sometimes a younger person with a gift for it, would set down whatever they were holding and begin to speak. The Norse called this kind of storytelling by different names depending on its shape, but the feeling behind it was always the same: to fill the dim with something larger than the dim. The stories they told were not gentle ones. They moved through worlds where gods wrestled with forces that could unmake everything, where the boundaries between the living and the still present were permeable and near. Winter itself had a name in those stories. It had a face, and a hunger of its own. Fimble Winter. The great winter at the end of all things was a story they knew well. 3 winters without a summer between them, the sun growing faint, the world narrowing to cold. It was not a comfortable story, but it was told anyway, and listened to, and perhaps something in the telling made the actual winter feel smaller by comparison. If the worst winter imaginable was the one that ended the world, then this one, this ordinary survivable winter, was something else entirely. The sagas moved through battles and long sea crossings, through the particular loneliness of men far from home. They moved through the lives of ancestors whose names were still spoken, whose choices had shaped the very ground the longhouse stood on. There was a genealogical quality to the Norse oral tradition, a sense that the past was not separate from the present, but woven directly into it. The people in the room were continuous with everyone who had sat in similar rooms before them. A child listening to these stories in the firelight was not simply being entertained. Something was being handed to them, a sense of where they stood in a long line of people who had also endured, who had also kept the fire, who had also waited for the light to return. Music was part of it too, though perhaps not in the way that word suggests now. There were simple instruments, a lyre-like instrument the Norse called a tagelharpa, strung with horsehair, capable of a sound that was low and resonant, and slightly rough at the edges. The sound it made in a closed space seemed to come from somewhere inside the room, rather than from the instrument itself. It did not fill the longhouse, so much as deepen it. Songs were sung that had been sung before, in the same words, in the same order. There is a particular quality to a song you know completely, the way it moves through you without requiring any effort, the way the voice finds the notes before the mind has quite decided to sing them. In the long evenings that quality would have mattered. The familiar was a form of comfort that did not need to announce itself. There were also the riddles. The Norse loved riddles. Kennings, they called the more elaborate ones, compound expressions that named a thing by describing it sideways. The sea was the whale road. A sword was the wound serpent. Poetry was the mead of Odin. To speak in kennings was to show a particular kind of mind, one that could hold two images at once and feel the space between them. In winter, when the mind had long hours and little to rest on, that kind of wandering lateral thinking came more naturally. The long evenings were generative in their own quiet way. Someone would offer a riddle, and the Longhouse would think on it slowly. The way you think on something when your hands are occupied, and your eyes have nothing particular to find. An answer might arrive from an unexpected direction, from someone who had been silent for an hour. The laughter that followed was not loud, but it was warm, and it moved through the space the way warmth moves, gradually, touching everything. The nights were long enough to hold all of this and still have hours remaining. The stories would wind down eventually, the music grow softer, the riddles go unanswered until morning. One by one, the people of the Longhouse would find their places along the sleeping platforms, pulling furs over themselves, settling into the shared warmth of close bodies and slow breath. The fire would be banked carefully, its coals covered to hold through the night. It was a small and deliberate act, performed last before sleeping, the same person perhaps, every night, the way certain tasks belong to certain hands, without ever being formally assigned. Outside, the stillness was complete. The snow held the silence down like something soft and heavy. And inside, beneath the low roof and the drifting smoke, the Longhouse breathed its slow collective breath, carrying everyone through toward morning, and somewhere further on, toward the first faint suggestion that the light was beginning, almost imperceptibly, to return. The darkness before dawn in a Viking Longhouse had its own particular quality, not the darkness of an empty room, but the darkness of a space full of breathing, 30 people, perhaps more, each one adding their small warmth to the air. The firs would have risen and fallen in slow unison along the sleeping platforms, and the coals beneath their covering of ash would have held their dim glow, patient and low, waiting for the first person to wake and tend them. That first person mattered. Someone always woke earliest, and in the coldest months, those first waking moments carried a particular weight. The air near the roof would have been warmer, heavy with the accumulated breath of the night. Near the floor, near the doors, the cold would have pressed inward, a reminder of what waited outside and what the fire, however low, was holding at bay. The morning tasks arrived before full wakefulness. Water needed to be fetched, if the barrel had not frozen. Animals needed feeding, the cattle and goats that shared the far end of the Longhouse, whose warmth had been as deliberate a part of the building's design as the timber itself. Their sounds in the early morning would have been the first sounds of the day, the soft shifting of hooves on packed earth, the low murmur of animals stirring, the occasional long breath of a cow exhaling into the cold. These sounds were not intrusive. They were part of the texture of the place, as familiar as the smell of smoke or the feeling of frost on the inner walls near the eaves. A child born in that Longhouse would have grown up hearing cattle before hearing birdsong in winter, and would have found nothing strange in it. The animals were not guests. They were part of the household's economy of warmth. By midwinter, the food stores would have been the quiet center of every day's attention, not spoken of constantly, that would have served no purpose, but present in the back of every mind the way a low sound is present even when you are not listening for it. The dried fish hung from the rafters, the smoked meat in its wrappings, the grain in sealed vessels, the hard cheese beside it. Each of these things had been prepared in autumn, with exactly this season in mind. Each one also represented a kind of calculation. How many mouths? How many months? How much margin remained? It was a slow arithmetic, never fully resolved, simply carried from one day into the next. And yet the carrying of it had its own steadiness, the way a familiar weight eventually becomes part of how you move, rather than something that slows you down. There was a Norse word, need, that carried the meaning of need, of necessity, of the particular pressure that comes when what you have is not quite enough. It was not a word of despair, exactly. It was a word that acknowledged difficulty without collapsing into it. A practical word, for a practical people who had learned that winter was not an interruption of life, but a condition of it. Surviving that condition required a certain steadiness of mind alongside the physical preparations, and that steadiness was something the culture actively shaped and valued, not simply a matter of temperament, but something cultivated over generations. The Norse sagas are full of figures who face hardship without excess of feeling, who speak plainly in difficult moments, who act without the kind of visible distress that might unsettle those around them. This was not coldness. It was a form of care. To remain composed was to offer the people near you something they needed. In the Longhouse, that composure would have been visible in small ways. The person who fed the animals without being asked, the one who noticed the water barrel was low before anyone mentioned it, the hands that mended without drawing attention to the mending. These were the gestures by which a community held its shape under pressure, not through grand declarations, but through the steady repetition of small necessary things. The children were part of this too, old enough to carry, to fetch, to hold a tool. They would have been given real work, not because childhood was brief or unvalued, but because useful occupation was its own form of stability. A child with a task is a child who belongs to what is happening around them, and belonging, in a sealed longhouse in the depths of a Norse winter, was not a small thing. There were also the elders, whose presence shaped the room in ways that had nothing to do with physical labor. Memory lived in them, the memory of other winters, harder ones, or ones that had turned more gently, and the accumulated knowledge of how things had been managed before. When someone older said that the stores would last, it carried a different weight than the same reassurance from someone younger. Not because the older person necessarily knew more, but because they had been here before and were still here to say so. The fire, banked through the night and carefully revived each morning, would have been the first thing fully attended to before anything else could properly begin. Coals were uncovered, gently. Dry wood was added in small amounts, not to rush the flame, but to coax it, the way you coax something that has been patient all night and deserves a measured response. The smoke would have risen again, finding its way toward the vents in the roof, and the warmth would have begun its slow spread outward from the hearth. There was a rhythm to all of it, that over months would have become nearly unconscious, the same sequence of actions, the same small sounds, the same gradual brightening of the space as the fire grew and the day settled into its dim, familiar shape. Ritual is perhaps too formal a word for it. It was more like the way a path forms in a field, not planned but worn into place by the same feet returning again and again, until the way forward is simply known. And in that knowing, there was something that held people steady. Not comfort in any soft sense, but the deep, quiet reassurance of a life that has found its own form. One that fits the season it is living through, and does not require the season to be anything other than what it is. The rhythm they had found, that worn, familiar path through each day, would have carried a particular quality in the final stretch of winter. Not the desperate endurance of the earliest weeks, when the cold was still new and the stillness still surprising. Something older had settled in by now, a kind of patience that had been earned slowly, the way calluses form, without anyone deciding to grow them. By this point in the season, the people inside the Longhouse would have known each other in a way that most people never come to know anyone. Not the knowing of shared history or long conversation, but the knowing that comes from closeness, from months of sleeping within arm's reach of the same breathing, the same coughing, the same small restless movements in the night. You would have known which of the cattle shifted first in the morning. You would have known whose footsteps sounded heavier near the door. You would have known, without looking, who had woken before you, and who was still somewhere in the softness of sleep. There is a strange intimacy in that kind of knowing, not always comfortable, not always welcome, but real in a way that is difficult to find in any other circumstances. The smell of the place would have settled into everything by now, into hair and wool, and the wooden walls themselves. Smoke and animals, and the faint sourness of stored food slowly diminishing. Tallow candles, when they were lit, gave off their own particular warmth. Something between animal fat and something almost sweet, the way a thing smells when it is being slowly consumed by its own light. The floor rushes, replaced when possible but not always possible, would have held the gathered scent of the entire season beneath them. It was not a clean smell, but it was not an empty one either. It was the smell of a place that had been lived in deeply, without interruption for a very long time. Sound, too, would have had its own texture by the late weeks of winter. The Longhouse was never silent, Animals breathed and shifted. The fire moved quietly inside itself. The wind pressed against the walls with varying degrees of insistence. There would have been a particular quality to the sounds of this period, a kind of worn familiarity, the way a familiar song sounds different after you have heard it many hundreds of times, not less meaningful, just more known, absorbed into the background of things, the way the sound of your own breathing disappears when you stop listening for it. The light on the days when someone opened the door and the pale winter sky was visible would have seemed almost new, not because it was luminous, it would not have been, not in the way summer is luminous, but because it was different from the firelight that had been the only illumination for so many hours of every day. Firelight moves, it shifts and leans and changes as the wood beneath it changes. Daylight, even grey and low, is steady. It falls evenly, without flickering. And after months of living inside the warm, unsteady glow of a hearth, that steadiness would have felt like something worth pausing for. The animals wintered alongside the people would have been showing their own signs of the long season by now. Cattle grow lean in winter, their ribs more visible beneath their coats, their movements slower and more deliberate. The goats would have been watched closely. Their milk, if any remained at this stage, was valuable enough that their condition mattered in a practical and immediate way. Fodder had been measured out since autumn, and the quiet calculation of what remained against the week still ahead was one that someone in the household would have been carrying without speaking of it, the way certain burdens are held until they must be named. There were also the sounds that came from outside, the ones that arrived without warning and required a moment of stillness before they could be released, a branch falling under gathered snow, the long, low movement of ice on a nearby river or fjord, a sound somewhere between a groan and a murmur, as if the frozen surface was speaking to itself about the weight it was holding. These were known sounds, sounds that had names and explanations, but they were sounds that asked the body to pause, briefly, before returning to what it had been doing. And in that pausing, something small but real was present. The people inside the longhouse were still in contact with the world outside, still registering its changes, still reading its signals, still oriented toward the landscape even when they could not move through it freely. The walls of the longhouse were not a separation from the world, so much as a membrane, thin enough that the outside could still be felt, still heard, still present in the room, in its quiet, indirect way. The stores would have been at their lowest now. What had been preserved through autumn, smoked fish, dried meat, root vegetables, grain stored against moisture and cold, was reaching its final margins. What remained was enough. Probably enough. The kind of enough that requires a certain steadiness of mind to live alongside, because it is not the comfortable abundance of early winter, but the measured, watchful sufficiency of a season that has asked a great deal and is not quite finished asking. And yet the light was changing. Slowly, in the way that all the most important things change, not all at once, not with any announcement, but gradually, the way a color deepens before you have noticed it beginning to shift. The days were lengthening, by minutes, then by something more than minutes. The angle of the pale sun had begun, almost without being noticed, to alter, not enough to warm anything yet. Not enough to be certain of, but enough to be seen by people who had been watching for it with the full, patient attention of those who have learned that the return of light is not a given. It is something that must be waited for and received. The first real sign was not the light itself. It was the shadows. When the sun finally climbed high enough to clear the southern tree line, even for a short while, even at a low and wandering angle, the shadows it left behind were long and soft, and full of a color that had been absent for weeks, a blue that was not the blue of ice or of cold, but something more tender than that, something that belonged to the turning of a season rather than the middle of it. The shadows fell across the snow and lay there, quiet and unhurried, and anyone who stepped outside and saw them would have known, without needing to say it aloud, that the worst had passed. Inside the longhouse, the change arrived more slowly. The walls were still dim with smoke. The smell of animals and unwashed wool and old fire had settled so deeply into the wood and the air that it had become indistinguishable from the place itself, not something anyone noticed anymore, the way you stop noticing the weight of a familiar coat. The fire still needed feeding. The remaining food still needed to be managed with care. But something in the quality of the waiting had shifted. The long, interior stillness of midwinter That particular inward drawing of attention, that narrowing of the world to what was immediately present, had begun, almost without announcement, to loosen. There would have been a morning, somewhere in this slow returning, when someone rose before the others and found that the light coming through the smoke hole was different, not brighter, exactly, but present in a way it had not been for a long time, arriving at an angle that suggested the sun had somewhere further to go, rather than simply hovering at its lowest reach before retreating again. The fire would have been low, the coals still holding their warmth from the night. The animals would have been stirring. And in that early, quiet moment, before the household had fully come to life around them, a person standing in that thin new light might have felt something they had almost forgotten how to feel. Not joy exactly, something more like the slow return of a breath that had been held for a very long time. The Norse had a word for this season of returning. They called it goi, a name given to the weeks that belonged to neither the deep of winter nor the first real warmth of spring, but to the narrow passage between them. It was a time of practical preparation and of something less practical, but equally real, a gathering of the self after the long months of inward living. The looms that had been worked through the dim weeks produced cloth that would eventually be worn or traded or given. The tools that had been mended and shaped by firelight were ready for the ground when the ground was ready for them. The children who had been born into that winter, or who were young enough that each winter still held the quality of something enormous and not entirely known, would have begun to move differently. The restlessness that had been building through the confined months, that low and persistent energy that had nowhere easy to go, would have found its way out into the snow, into the longer afternoons, into the simple act of being outside without the cold being quite so insistent. There is something in the way children register a change of season that is less measured than the way adults do. They feel it in the body before they understand it in any other way. The elders would have known it differently. Through the accumulated weight of many winters, the return of light carries a quality that is not only relief, but something closer to recognition. The season had come back, as it always had. The stores had held as they usually did. The fire had not gone out. For those who had lived through enough of these long returns, the arrival of Goi was not a surprise but a confirmation, a quiet, steady reminder that the world was still following its pattern, still moving through its long and patient cycle, still turning toward the warmth as it had always turned. The Longhouse itself would have begun to change in small ways. Furs that had served as walls against the cold were sometimes moved or adjusted. The central fire, which had been the absolute center of everything for months, the thing they had fed and tended and watched with the full, serious attention of people who understood what it meant, could now be managed with a little less vigilance, not abandoned, not neglected, but tended with something slightly less urgent in the hands that fed it. The fire had been the heart of the winter. Now it was becoming, slowly, just a fire again. And somewhere in all of this, in the returning shadows and the loosening cold, and the first days when the sun stayed long enough to leave a faint warmth on a south-facing wall, the stories that had been told through the long dim months settled into memory. The winter had been a kind of vessel. It had held the people together, pressed them close, filled them with the old narratives and the slow woven rhythms of shared living. What they carried out of it was not only the practical knowledge of having survived, it was the less visible knowledge of having remained themselves, of having held on to one another in the dim and the cold and the smoke, until the world turned again and the light came back, as it always, in the end, came back. Thank you for being here tonight. Good night.